Yo, what's going on guys, it's Cynical and welcome back to another video. Today for you guys, we have a massive Final Fantasy XVI news blowout. Recently, Naoki Yoshida has been hard at work, sitting down with a bunch of gaming journalists to talk more so about 16 and better explain its systems. Now, what we know of from the two trailers that we have so far is that, yes, 16 is going to be an action RPG, but we don't know overly really too much about these systems overall. The game is looking very much like a real-time action RPG, and the actual action combat seems very in line with something like Devil May Cry, or of course Kingdom Hearts. As I was saying in the recent trailer breakdown, this is probably the most real-time a Final Fantasy game has been, aside from the likes of Stranger of Paradise that released this year. This is also a mainline Final Fantasy game, so the quality is going to be extremely high, and I suppose it's both of those factors put together that gets me so excited for this game. It's probably the most excited I've been for a Final Fantasy title aside from 15, as well as Final Fantasy VII Remake. When we look at 15 though, the gameplay wasn't truly real-time, while it definitely used an action-orientated combat system. For that game, we were certainly expecting something along the lines of the gameplay found in Kingdom Hearts, or of course something like Devil May Cry, but didn't turn out to exactly be like that. And then looking at Final Fantasy VII Remake, while yes it is an action RPG, the game still uses a command system incorporated into its action combat, making for slower paced battles so that the player can actually think about what they want to execute and how they're going to deal with the situation without everything happening all at once. This right here, Final Fantasy XVI, is very much real-time, in line with Kingdom Hearts, and in line with something like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry. So this video is going to be talking about primarily the combat and also some other things that we got too. Really the main juicy parts of all of these interviews that have recently come out, but there is just so many different interviews and a lot of information, so let's dive in. So just to reiterate the fact that this is a true real-time action RPG title, because I know that there was a little bit of skepticism sort of surrounding the gameplay so far. We don't know if it really is truly real-time or if it might be sort of in line with something like Final Fantasy VII Remake. Here is the confirmation straight from Square Enix themselves. With Final Fantasy XVI, we wanted to appeal to as wide a range of gamers as possible by setting the story in a classic Final Fantasy world that's reminiscent of early Final Fantasy games, but combining that with fast-paced, real-time action. We have a comprehensive support system in place for players who aren't too confident with action games, so even if action isn't your thing, I hope you'll give it a try. One other reason we went with an action-based battle system this time around is to push the boundaries of what a Final Fantasy game can be, and expands the range of possibility for the developers who pick up the reins of the series after us. I think for a lot of Final Fantasy fans, even though there tends to be that divide between Final Fantasy going in the action-orientated direction versus the traditional turn-based direction, a lot of people have been waiting for Final Fantasy to become a true real-time action RPG, and this right here is going to be the first one. Aside from the very interesting amalgamation of what is mostly action RPG infused with classic type turn-based systems incorporated into Final Fantasy VII Remake's gameplay, which by the way I believe is the perfect amalgamation of action RPG meets old era systems from turn-based. Again, this is what I wanted Final Fantasy XV to be, but it didn't exactly turn out to be like that. Even though I love Final Fantasy XV, combat wasn't really what I was expecting, and to be honest, it was one of the weaker links of that game. Even though I will say it was so refreshing to play an action-based Final Fantasy game. Around the reveal of 16 back in 2020, it was unveiled that Square Enix had hired Ryota Suzuki, the lead gameplay designer of Devil May Cry 5, to be on board with 16 to help out in its gameplay department, which is absolutely insane, meaning that Final Fantasy XVI is certainly in good hands. More information on specifically Ryota and his involvement with the game has been shared, but let's just quickly run over his history. He is of course known notably for Devil May Cry 5. He was the lead combat design on that game, and DMC5 was absolutely insane. He also previously worked on Devil May Cry 4, as well as Dragon's Dogma, as well as the Capcom fighting games. This is a man who definitely has expertise when it comes to action-orientated games. And I think it was pretty clear from the get-go, from that very initial Final Fantasy XVI trailer that we got back in 2020, with those gameplay snippets we saw in that trailer, it looked very Devil May Cry. There were even videos that were posted out onto YouTube that were comparing the gameplay found in Devil May Cry to that of what we were seeing in that trailer, and 16's combat with dodging, parrying, attack combos looks very reminiscent input to that of a DMC game, which is a direct result of having Suzuki on board with the design team. Yoshida mentioned that the development team didn't really have too much experience with action games, and that Suzuki really kind of brought everything together to lead them in the right direction, mentioning that Clive, the main protagonist, has so many different ability trees, and that all of these different abilities can seamlessly be sort of stringed and customized together, something that is possible through having Suzuki on board. And if you look at the combat depth of a game like Devil May Cry, then you absolutely know that Final Fantasy XVI is in good hands. But it's not just Ryoto Suzuki who's on board with the gameplay design for 16, the Kingdom Hearts team has also been helping out too. Yes, I know, this is turning into like Mama's ultimate recipe for the spiciest meatball. This is coming from the Washington Post, saying the Kingdom Hearts team at Square Enix has been especially helpful in contributing to those real-time combat and boss battles. It can be said that the battles in Final Fantasy XVI are in some ways a culmination of the company's past experiences. Yoshida did mention that Square Enix hadn't really had a good track record of developing action-orientated games aside from Kingdom Hearts, which I guess is shots fired towards any other action game or action RPG that Square in the past have developed. But he does believe that Square is now in a position where they do have expertise in developing good action games. And true, I mean, Square Enix have definitely come a long way. I honestly do believe that their strongest action game that they have under their belt is without a doubt Kingdom Hearts. It is probably the best action RPG that exists. Of course, you guys know that I'm 100% biased, but really, I do feel as if other developers should certainly take notes as to how well crafted of an action RPG Kingdom Hearts is. So knowing that the Kingdom Hearts team is also assisting in the gameplay department of this game really does get me excited. Now, circling back to that information we were first talking about with how Square Enix said that there is a support system in place for those people who might not particularly like action games or aren't exactly too good at them, that there is support here, though it's not really support in the sense of what Final Fantasy VII Remake did with, I believe, the tactical system that they ended up putting into the game, which literally sort of allows the player to kind of like pause the battle midway through mid-gameplay and sort of turns it into like a traditional turn-based Final Fantasy setup, giving the player time to sort of strategically think out what their next move is going to be and to order the playable character and party members from there on in. But rather, 16 will have something in place that kind of automates the game to a degree so that the player can kind of breeze through the game to enjoy it for its story and not have to sort of stress out about everything that's going on all at once mid-gameplay. If this is, of course, your preferred playstyle, you just want to embrace the story, this setup is here for those players. Coming from Game Watch, they did mention that they're not really all too keen on action games, and Yoshida went on to mention that he can understand this feeling. When he comes home from work, he wants to be able to just sort of chill out and play games and not have to play a game that's going to be super stressful with big crazy battles. He mentions that there is an accessory item in the game that can almost pretty much switch the game into automatic mode, and goes on to explain that the accessory is called immediately before the hit throw. These translations are going to be a little bit off, but he does mention that's not the official name. Apparently what this does is just before Clive is about to be hit, time will slow down and you'll have an opportunity to press R1. Doing this will dodge Clive out of the way, so instead of everything happening within split seconds, this item is going to slow down time Matrix style and you'll get a chance to really think, okay, maybe I should press R1 to dodge. He mentions that this will give players time to think about what they should do once they have dodged, like performing a combo, maybe healing, and that there is also an auto accessory too that apparently can even sort of almost fight for you, basically automating Clive to choose the best combat options and combinations that would best suit the situation in hand. He mentions that for the story focus difficulty mode, you'll start off with these auto accessories. For the action focus difficulty, these accessories still do exist within the game, except you don't start off with them, you'll find them later on in the game. Of course, these are just accessory items, and for story focus mode, you are given them straight off the bat, so it will be up to you, even in story focus mode, as to whether or not you want to equip them. I'd say there will be other changes that will apply to story focus mode, like reduced enemy health. Your health might be increased as well as your damage, so you can kind of like play around with it. If you want like a really automated gameplay experience, then story focus mode is there, but if you want sort of a slightly easier experience, you can still go with story focus, I'm assuming, and just not equip the accessories. But either way, it's great to know that the team is catering towards the people that don't really enjoy action combat and just want to embrace a Final Fantasy story. Now, talking about traditional systems, a lot of people have been wondering as to whether or not there is going to be party members in 16, as from what we've seen in gameplay so far, it appears to be that Clive has been by himself. We haven't seen any party members in sight, and you guys know when it comes to Final Fantasy, one of the core things is that you always have a party setup. So yes, party members do exist in Final Fantasy XVI. Thanks to the IGN interview, Yoshida mentioned, "We didn't want to overwhelm users in our newest trailer, so we focused solely on Clive's battles. That said, for most of his journey, Clive will be accompanied by one or more companions. These companions will participate in battle as well as trade banter with Clive. That said, the party members will be AI driven so as to allow players to focus solely on controlling Clive." So it's great to know party members are here, and I'm really looking forward to the banter thing that's going on. We'll see some really cool dynamics, no doubt, between the relationship of Clive and the different companions we'll meet along the way. I think this is one of the coolest things with Final Fantasy 15 is the team really did a good job of the banters between Noctis and his friends. It was one of the most enjoyable aspects of the game. So I'm hoping that we'll have a similar setup and quality of banters again for 16. But the mention of solely controlling Clive lets me know that most likely they're probably going to go with this thing of like you won't really have much control over the party members. As mentioned, they are AI controlled, so they'll pretty much just be doing their own thing. The party system has always worked in a way of you're able to issue your party members commands, whether it be offensive, defensive, support, etc. So it kind of seems like they're just going to be doing their own thing here. Whether or not we're going to be able to equip these party members with different equipment and whatnot, who exactly knows? But it really does seem as if the direction of this game really wants you to focus solely on Clive, controlling him and putting all of your thought and effort into that one specific character. Summons are another staple point of a Final Fantasy game, and obviously summons are a major focus on 16, being absolutely vital to that of the story of the game. They're going to be like the absolute epicenter of this game's lore. But what about when it comes to the gameplay side of things? Within the gameplay footage, we have seen some pretty crazy boss sort of sequences here, where it looks like we are actually controlling the icons versing off against another icon. This is literally some kaiju Godzilla-based craziness. I'm really looking forward to this, and we got some information as to how exactly these icon gameplay situations are kind of going to work. So coming from the Game Informer interview, mentioned here, the overall game design for these icon versus icon battles, however, is meant to be unique, and in fact, we don't actually use the same exact system twice. Each battle is completely unique in its playstyle, and so we're doing something that's kind of crazy. For example, maybe one icon versus icon battle. If you have icon A versus icon B, that battle will be reminiscent of a 3D shooter, whereas another icon versus a different icon, it's more like a pro wrestling match. And then maybe even a third with one icon versus another icon will transform an entire arena into a battlefield. And so again, we didn't reuse these systems, and each one of these icon versus icon battles is unique and will change with each battle. because of that, and because the battles are so different in nature, the UI has to change for each battle, and so you will see slight differences in the UI between these battles. However, we ended up having to cut a lot of that from the trailer because it ends up being story spoilers, and we didn't want to have that. So depending on what icon you are using to verse another icon, the gameplay is going to be completely different. So as mentioned, first person shooter was brought up there. Makes me think maybe for the Phoenix icon, because it is a Firebird, it'll be like a first person shooter, and that the UI will reflect exactly what kind of playstyle is currently in hand. The first person shooter setup could totally work for Ramu and Shiva as well. In the trailer we do see Shiva sending out a bunch of ice projectiles towards Titans, so makes me think likely it could be her. The mention of wrestling kind of makes me think of Titans, so using Titan, the gameplay will be like a fighting type wrestling game. Turning the entire scenario into a battlefield kind of makes me think of Odin, seeing as he is the warrior on a horse type setup. It's going to bring in some true variety and uniqueness into these icon fights. And that was one thing that I was talking about in the trailer breakdown, is that are these icon big giant kaiju battles involved, or are they quite automated and it's just sort of, I guess, quick time events? No, it seems like there is actually a lot of gameplay thought being put into each of these fights. Also, with the way that this is worded, may possibly point towards some kind of choice over what icon you want to verse against off another icon, so that's kind of interesting. Of course, those are the icon fights versus other icons, but what about summons just in general in normal field gameplay? Well, from the seams of things, that is going to work in the ways of Clive being able to literally absorb the powers of each icon so that he can pull off flashy, cool moves, as we've already seen in gameplay snippets from the trailers. And the last thing that I wanted to touch upon here is that we did get the confirmation that 16 is not an open world game. I guess that is sort of the expectation in our current day and age as to, like, is this RPG open world or what is it? And to be fair, honestly speaking, this is really good news. It is going to be a linear experience, with them mentioning that it will be independent area-based game design, but that right there makes me think it will be large open areas, but not like true open world. So I guess if you kind of think of like Final Fantasy XIV versus something like World of Warcraft is a massive open world MMORPG, whereas Final Fantasy XIV, being an MMORPG, uses big, wide open, independent areas that are segmented from one another. This means that, yeah, 16 will be linear, but because it looks like it's probably going to use very large, wide open areas, it's not going to be traditional linearity. Honestly, it makes me happy that this is going to be a linear game, because in our current day and age, we are absolutely drowning in the open world game formula. It is a little bit exhausting, and unless a developer can bring forth some real true new breath of fresh air, like with, I guess, what The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild did, it's the same repeated gameplay formula time and time again. It's cool to see that Final Fantasy XV tried to dip its toes into the open world format, but even then that game kind of gets criticized with how the world sort of felt a little bit barren, and that more could have ultimately have been done with it. If you look at a linear game experience, it tends to be more of a fleshed out experience, as the developer can put more time into smaller areas that, in the end result, end up being so much more cohesive. So that right there, guys, is a massive bunch of new information towards the gameplay side of 16. I, for one, am just ecstatic for this game to know that the Devil May Cry gameplay designer as well as the Kingdom Hearts team are helping out with the combat design of this game. Just gets me absolutely pumped. This really is going to be a massive breath of fresh air for the mainline Final Fantasy series. I think this is the massive step forward and true innovation that the Final Fantasy series has needed for a long time now. Go back to the roots in the sense of the setting and the storytelling, but bring forth some innovation when it comes to the gameplay formula. Something that is so different to what the series is usually used to, but could ultimately benefit the series in pushing it forward into a direction that it's never taken before, harnessing a new audience, but also appeasing that of already existing fans. Yoshida has also mentioned that there is going to be another trailer that will drop this year, towards the end of the year, Japanese autumn, I believe. My bets would probably have to be on September during the Tokyo game show. Apparently that trailer is going to be focused on the world and the lore of the game. I would say a true deep dive on 16's gameplay will probably happen sometime next year, leading up to the release next summer. However guys, leave your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below as always. I've been Cynical, hopefully having a fantastic day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.